welcome everyone. Good morning. Good to, I can't quite say be here, but be here virtually anyway. We're going to focus on some of the issues facing us in terms of climate change, but from a very much a psychological perspective, but also one that tries to, as Fahad said, deal both with the internal and the external, the psychological and the social and political, and the constant interplay between those two things. And I'm going to, my talk's going to be in sort of two parts. And after the first part, I'll pause. Because the first part is going to focus primarily on the issue of shame and the psychological disaster which accompanies neoliberalism at the present moment in time. And then we'll have an opportunity for any thoughts that you have or contributions that you'd like to make or questions, and then I'll carry on for another quarter of an hour with another part, which is more upbeat and more about, well, what can we do about this? What's the way, what in political speak, what's the way forward? So let me start with the first part of this paper. So the growthism of the global north currently threatens to irreversibly damage the planet that we live on. And yet most solutions to the climate emergency fall into the category of green growth. But there's an alternative to this, which has two aspects to it. The first recognizes the starkly unequal enjoyment of the basic necessities of life, particularly between the global north and south, and therefore the need for some continued growth along with a massive program of redistribution to address this. The second dimension demonstrates that beyond a certain point, continued growth does not lead to increases in well-being, but to its opposite. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. Now, growth is measured by GDP. Gross domestic product. And I visit the UK government website and I ask it the question, what is GDP? And it tells me, it says GDP matters because it shows how healthy the economy is. It tells me that GDP is all the money spent on goods and services by individuals, corporations, and government. But what doesn't count towards GDP? Well, what are called transfer payments, e.g. state pensions, unemployment benefit, for a start. But clearly these are public goods. And if a society had introduced a universal basic income, then that wouldn't count either. More crucially, goods and services which are not monetized don't count. So if you look after your kids and elderly relatives at home, this doesn't count. In other words, much of women's work, traditionally conceived, doesn't count. But if you put your kids or your mother in a private nursery or residential home, then it does count. Even more crucially, GDP only counts what can be measured and priced. And if it can't be counted, then it doesn't count. In 1968, years ago, Robert Kennedy put it like this, quote, GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except for that which makes life worthwhile. Now, the economist Jason Hickel, in his book, Less is More, highly recommended, really interesting book, states, after a certain point, which high-income nations have long surpassed, more GDP adds little, if anything, to human flourishing. He also recognises that actually beyond a certain point, more growth begins to have a negative effect on people's well-being. Now, we know that this is certainly the case for people's mental health, that in countries like the UK and USA, we're facing a mental health epidemic, particularly for young people, one that includes addiction, health, self-harm, and suicide. So what is it about growthism that has precipitated this kind of psychological collapse? In 1973, after the coup that brought down the elected Allende government in Chile, it became the laboratory for a new kind of economics, which recognized neither the state, except for the armed forces and the police, nor society, and where the market came to govern all aspects of life. Thus began a half-century of economic fundamentalism, something we now know fondly by the term neoliberalism. The leash was taken off capitalism, and what climate scientists refer to as the great acceleration in carbon emissions got underway. This market fundamentalism has a profound effect upon the self. As I began to work as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist some 20 years ago, my social antennae began to pick up traces of these effects in the lives of the patients that I started to see. My psychoanalytic training had prepared me to look for guilt and repression. But what I found was that the people coming through the door were not people burdened by guilt because their impulses were morally bad. No, they were people overwhelmed by shame that they were simply not good enough. And to be not good enough was to be a failure, a loser, and nothing. Now, neoliberalism is not just a set of policies, it's also a rationality, a way of thinking and feeling and being in the world. For neoliberals, economic freedom creates the conditions for the fittest to survive and prosper. No lame ducks here, but rather the myth of the heroic entrepreneur standing on his or her own 2 feet, fighting off predators, seeking out opportunities, and building a business. Read the first part of Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged, the Bible of neoliberalism, to see it all there. We must ensure we're fit, physically and mentally, to compete. Lean, flexible, and resilient. The self becomes reconstrued as a commodity. How can I add value to myself? The self must be constantly improved as if it was an essential asset in one's portfolio. Nowadays, there are a whole range of apps and products from Fitbit to Peloton to help the self improve its physical fabric. The Australian sociologist Deborah Lupton sees Fitbit as a harbinger of what she calls self-tracking cultures. Self-trackers are already forming their own largely online communities around fitness centres and websites such as Quantified Self, where subscribers can share downloaded Fitbit data and benchmark their performances against their peers. Self-trackers engage in a constant process of monitoring their vital signs, pulse, blood pressure, blood oxygen, saturation levels, and so on, as they run, push weights, chill, work, and sleep. Lupton cites one self-tracker saying, "My goal is to basically be an optimal human being in every aspect of my life." Increasingly, mental health services, both publicly and privately provided, have become incorporated to improve the psychological fabric of the self and enhance its ability to perform. Literally, as I wrote this a few days ago, an email arrived from an organisation called Augmentive Wellbeing and Performance. And note the way in which it links these two things. An Augmentive offers the logistic support to professionals engaged in coaching, therapy, nutrition, exercise, medical, and complementary health. In the modern organisation, the self, like nature, has become a resource to be harnessed. Human resource management is concerned to optimize the performance of the self through a range of performance management techniques. Although some of these are soft and cuddly, most of these are strongly rational and calculative. Professor Stephen Ball, probably the preeminent scholar of education in the United Kingdom, puts it thus, quote, "Teachers are represented and encouraged to think about themselves as individuals who calculate about themselves, add value to themselves, improve their productivity, strive for excellence, and live an existence of calculation." Generalizing from the world of teaching to the experience of the educated middle class in contemporary society, Ball reflects on, quote, "the sense of being constantly judged in different ways, by different means, according to different criteria, through different agents and agencies. We become ontologically insecure, unsure whether we're doing enough, doing the right thing, doing as much as others, or as well as others, constantly looking to improve, to be better, to be excellent." The modern organization wants all of us. It wants our personality, our flexibility, and our transferability. To stay ahead of our competitors, we need to engage in constant self-development. It is not just financial markets that operate in a 24-hour real-time flow, but with their smartphones and iPads, an increasing number of today's professional workers do the same. One constantly measures oneself against a set of external criteria. Am I meeting my targets? Performativity is about doing, not being. It conjures that imagined world which, according to the tired jingles of HR managers, the empowered self goes about making a difference. It's the world of the active voice, of imaginary control over one's environment and over one's own self, of shaping one's destiny. This is a phallic order, one which nevertheless marches beneath the shadow of failure, shame, and humiliation. Caught in the grip of the ideal, the modern self hardly ever feels itself to be enough. It never measures up. It always falls short before the imagined gaze of the other. Brief moments when the demand of the ideal is satisfied punctuate the background hum of performance anxiety. They mostly bring temporary relief rather than euphoria. Fitbit self-trackers simply give shape and form to a self engaged in a treadmill-like way, not just with work, but with all areas of life, including consumption, the one sphere where we're told we're free. The beleaguered self is so preoccupied with everyday survival that a realistic awareness of external dangers is absent, other than in fleeting and catastrophizing ways which make effective action impossible. Shame is the emotion of failure. Unlike guilt, which relates to what we do, shame relates to who we are, and specifically to the feeling that we're inadequate, deficient, and not enough. As neoliberalism has weakened the solidaristic ties that bound workers and communities together in the post-war period, failure has become increasingly individualized. Whilst winners are idealized, no one wants to be a loser. A gnawing, semi-permanent feeling of failure and inadequacy is a consequence of such performative regimes where the ideal remains forever elusive. So many of the people I see believe themselves to be just not enough, not slim enough, not manly enough, not clever enough, not successful enough, not sexual enough. The list goes on. I think it may be useful to think of the self when it takes up this position as the abject self. There is little euphoria when objectives are met, just temporary relief from otherwise ongoing feelings of persecution. The fragility of this thin-skinned narcissism is manifest in the constant vigilance in relation to almost invisible slights and setbacks that precipitate narcissistic injuries. The contemptuous internal voice, which attacks the neoliberal self, calling it out for its inadequacy and failure, is of course like Freud's superego, but with a difference, for it is failure to reach a performative rather than moral ideal which cannot be tolerated. And transgression elicits shame rather than guilt. This ego-destructive superego operates a bit like an internal dictator or mafia boss governing the territory where, in the face of its suffering, the abject self takes refuge. Shame provokes two different reactions. It makes the self shrink, feel small, and want to hide. But it also provokes rage, a rage which often dare not express itself openly towards its object. Shame lends itself to projection. In an effort to avoid feeling shame in myself, I project it into the other. This is the classic dynamic underlying racism, sexism, and classism. And it is striking how pervasive shame has become in everyday life. John Ronson, whose recent book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, looks at online shaming, argues that we're living through a great renaissance of public shaming. At a more intimate level, there seems to be an epidemic of online shaming in schools using Facebook and Instagram, from slut shaming to the various forms of cyberbullying, now reported right across Europe and the USA. Unsurprisingly, there is now evidence of a direct correlation between body shame and the use of social media such as Facebook. Shaming is a form of cultural violence, providing an outlet for the anger of the shamed. People have to struggle through the persecutory experiences of performance anxiety before they can get to the experience of loss and guilt. And this in turn is often so painful that it leads to a flight back into survivalism. I wonder whether the fragility of the self in neoliberal society is such that in an encounter with the real and the loss, grief and guilt that this entails would actually be a significant cultural achievement, equivalent to a radical shift from a survivalist culture to what Sally Weintraub calls a culture of care. It follows that survivalism is manifest not just by the activities of religious cranks holing up in deepest Montana as they wait for the rapture, nor more benignly by those who drop out to build ecotopias in the few wild places left in the world. Rather, I think survivalism best describes the internal climate and everyday life of many, perhaps even a majority, of neoliberal citizens, and not just in the West, but increasingly in China and other modernizing cultures. So, what is this alternative to this survivalist state of mind? So, let me just pause at that point, Fahad, and welcome any thoughts or questions that anybody has before I move on.
Yeah, so if you're going to speak, please unmute yourselves. And I'm going to continue. The recording just sees Paul. So if you do speak, you won't be seen on screen.
Paul, I just want to thank you for saying so much that I've been feeling, coming from education and psychotherapy, and feeling that almost everybody I've met in education and in the therapy relationship feels that they're not good enough. That's exactly the strongest experience that my work has been, to help to connect with how they really are. And that's been wonderful. Okay, a little of wonderful, but obviously I'm a small pea in a great big pod.
Paul, when you were speaking, it occurred to me that this drive for growth is almost an addiction, and when you start to talk to people about growth, they almost take it as an offense that you're taking something from them if they're unable to be in a space where they can grow. And I wonder if that's something that we need to think about as an addiction.
I would.
Anne, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I would put with that something that the number of the words that you've used resonate with me and my hobby horse of horror at wellness and the displacement onto the body, all the physical words that and the physical things that we monitor, rather than addressing feelings and morals. And I had a patient, a youngish woman, sitting opposite me a couple of years ago, wearing a Fitbit. And I made an interpretation, and she responded by looking at her wrist and saying, "You've put my heart rate up by 20 beats a minute." And I was completely blocked. I couldn't get past that on that occasion anyway. And it frightens me. It goes with your addiction analogy, because they're obviously substitutions, but they're also soulless. Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
I think the distinction you made between a performative self and an ethical self is really critical, because I'm reminded of that famous little line from Voltaire, who's saying about us making the best the enemy of the good. So however well I perform, I'm never going to achieve that endpoint. So I'm always going to have an experience of deficit. And it's really quite shocking to hear this education person you mentioned, talking about teachers as being calculative beings. That just sounds a total horror. So not only am I measuring myself, but they're measuring me. Trudy has a raised hand. Just go for it, Trudy.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I was just sort of thinking about, with such a huge preoccupation with survivalism, where, as individuals, we are just so, as a society, preoccupied with this performance anxiety, as you say, how difficult it is then to look outwards and externally to the issues like the climate emergency and the crisis that we have, because everyone is just, and certainly in the consulting room with therapists and the therapists that I've spoken to in my research, that they talk about their clients in this bubble of self, and then it's very difficult to have conversations that are beyond that and broader than that, and be able to consider how these external realities are impacting their experience. That was a comment, really.
Maybe that really connects. So I think I wanted to say the same in terms of how good it is to hear it said out loud, the things that I think in my head when I'm sitting with people. And particularly about a month ago, somebody in one of my groups, a woman in one of my groups, who had been feeling very suicidal, said, "I feel like the perfect product of capitalism. I just I'm so worried about whether I'm being productive enough. And I felt it was one of my proudest moments of, I'm so glad that could be said in here. But how can we talk about it more? But the other thing I wanted to say, I think to Anne's comment, is that having teenage children and also working with a lot of young people, I get a sense that we, a generation older, can look in from the outside on the Fitbits and maybe think of them as soulless, but for them, it's the water that they swim in and the air that they breathe. And it's just a question for everybody, just wondering how then to look at, to be able to have some perspective on that for them. And for ourselves to realize that the fact that we're on the outside looking in doesn't make a lot of sense to them.
It's interesting. One of my younger patients has a Facebook addiction, but in particular, it's an addiction to Facebook likes. Yeah, how many likes you're receiving for your posts or whatever it might be. And it just reminds me of what Jack was saying. There is something very strongly addictive quality in the ether of our culture at the present moment in time, manifest all the way from GDP down to Facebook likes in a strange sort of way.
I was out with my 7-year-old grandson and his younger brother a few months back, and we were out by the beach and he was inventing an imaginary game, and Granny had to join in, and he said, "You have to like me." I said, "I do, I love you." No, you have to click like to join the game. We were out by the sea. There was not a piece of tech in sight. And he spends loads of time outdoors and reads and all the stuff.
So how is this connecting to climate? We're talking a lot about technology here. So what is that? How is that connecting into our main theme for this morning? Question for you, Paul, I think.
Jack wanted to say something, I think.
Well, it was just a word that came to mind, was disavowal, in terms of people able to hold two things in their head at the same time, but complete opposite. They get it, but they don't understand that they're part of it as well. And that to me is the real rub. How do we get accountants who will nod at you when you talk about climate change and how bad it is, but they'll not change any behavior, they'll not change any thought in terms of what they do or see themselves as part of the problem.
Sorry, another thought for that is, people have used this term bubble, which I think is quite valuable. And it's the new technologies, the technologies of the self that we've been talking about, provide the kind of increasing the infrastructure to this bubble, the modern. There are a large number of people now who talk about the post-human. Yeah. That these new technologies are almost creating a kind of post-human dimension to experience.
Yeah.
And as with any bubble, I think the problem with a bubble is bubbles tend to burst. And when they burst, when reality breaks in, then it's a catastrophe. Yeah. It's all or nothing. It's a catastrophe. And I think that's what we're experiencing quite a bit with young people around climate change at the moment, that when the real breaks in, it's very difficult, not for those young people, well, for anybody for that matter, to feel completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Linda Hammond, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Farad. What was running through my mind was connecting with the thought around tech and its omnipresence and significance in young people's lives. It is the water in which they swim in, and somewhere I feel we have to work with that, understand that, because we are predominantly the older generation looking on, who haven't been immersed in that world. And I understand entirely the feeling that it's soulless. But the word that comes to my mind is moral, a moral endeavor. It's how we've been talking about the performative self and the world crashing in terms of climate change and that external reality. But it's how can young people, how can we create a climate in which we can acknowledge the world in which they live in, but also foster that sense of morality and concern, because there is within that strand of young people's expression of protest a real concern, I think, for and we carry a sense of guilt too about what we have done as a generation and as older generations in relation to the next generations coming up. So that it's played out writ large, some of these feelings of shame and its transformative elements into guilt in that arena. And young people are struggling to find their relationship to that. Sorry, it's a garbled thought, or there are several thoughts caught up in that.
Yeah. Gail had a hand up, and then after that, should we carry on, Paul? Mm-hmm. So Gail, last comment.
First of all, very appreciative of the last comments, which I thought were really important. And yes, I do know Stephen Ball's worked very well in education. And I liked what was said about addiction. And I've been trying to write a poem about the addiction of the super rich, because often, you know, I react with anger at everything that's going on. So I become part of the syndrome. And by offering a slightly more understanding approach to the drive for more and more money and more money, and never mind anything about anybody's health, and then to open that out from that sympathy and concern, which is genuine actually, because what on earth do they get from that total narrow focus except more money? And to see the planet and the beauty and how we're losing it and what we can do about it.
Thank you. So if you would all be so kind as to mute yourselves again, if you are unmuted, and back to Paul.
Okay, well, yeah, just one thought is we shouldn't locate the absence of the ethical in the younger generation. I mean, it's the older generation, it's us lot, yeah, if you like, who are primarily responsible for the fix that we're in. And I think in some ways it is particularly the very young, you know, the teenagers, late teenagers and early 20s, the Greta generation, who are actually leading the way in terms of an ethical response to this at the present moment in time. So in preparing for this event, I came across a notice from Extinction Rebellion that I'd filed away earlier this year. And it was an invitation to join in preparations for COP26 via what they called the First Trimester Project. And the invitation asked, quotes, "What if in the months leading up to COP26, we could conceive of and gestate ideas of a new era?" Later in the invitation, it quoted Jean-Paul Lederac, someone who spent his career in conflict transformation. And Lederac speaks of the moral imagination, which he defines as, quotes, "the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist." Now, maybe this is a happy coincidence, because what I want to talk about now is the idea of natality, introduced by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, back in 1958. The book was written in between two others which constitute the cornerstones of her work, On Totalitarianism in 1951 and Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1963. Arendt was clearly someone drawn to facing difficult truths, just as we are called upon to do the same today in the world facing twin and related ruins of runaway climate change, and the return of totalitarianism. In spite of, or perhaps because of the darkness that she looked into, Arendt's belief in the power of human goodness remained undaunted, and it was this belief that was crystallized in her idea of natality. As one of her biographers, Samantha Hill, noted, in the darkest hour of her life, as she contemplated suicide in an internment camp, she decided she loved life too much to give it up. Now, you might think that Arendt had found hope even in her darkest hour. But in fact, Arendt was very critical of hope. Like other observers of Nazism and Stalinism, such as Vasily Grossman and Primo Levi, Arendt had seen how hope had worked to disarm people and to render them obedient. Arendt argued that it was only when the inmates of the Warsaw Ghetto gave up hope and let go of fear that they lost their fatalism and began to fight. For Arendt, the idea of natality, of new beginnings, constituted a much more reliable and powerful force for good than hope. It may seem counterintuitive, but hope, as ordinarily conceived, induces passivity, a passive desire for a future outcome. Far from hope being intimately tied to action, it is in action that it more reliably accompanies. In contrast, natality and action are inextricably connected. Arendt says, quote, action has the closest connection to the human condition of natality. The new beginning, inherent in birth, can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting. And later, she says, to act means to take an initiative, to set something in motion. And it follows that the character of startling unexpectedness is inherent in all beginnings and in all origins. The fact that man is capable of action means that the unexpected can be expected from him, that he is able to perform what is infinitely improbable. And this again is possible only because each man is unique, so that with each birth, something uniquely comes into the world. Now, I believe that our experience as therapists suggests that there is an intimate relationship between the capacity to face the worst and new beginnings. Take an example of a woman whose partner has suddenly left her for a much younger woman after many years of what she thought was a good marriage. In her despair, she looks around and everything in her life seems to be in ruins. The good times had together in the past now seem like an illusion. Photographs, memories, and events have lost all of their meaning. Her very sense of self as partner, lover, and even as mother have been destroyed. Of course, one is tempted as a therapist to pass lightly over this despair, turn a blind eye to it in a well-meaning effort to help the other mitigate the pain that they feel. But I think what we've learned is to have enormous respect for people's capacity to face the worst when they feel they have the permission. It might sound odd to say this, but more often than not, people need to be given this permission. They need to feel that they can visit the despair with someone who does not need to be protected from it. And to really face the worst in this way, paradoxically, often brings relief. By naming it, what had previously been a source of internal terror loses much of its sting. One thinks of Roosevelt's famous phrase, "There is nothing to fear but fear itself." In facing the worst, we become stronger, and specifically, our will becomes stronger. I believe that I'm talking about a will for life, the intrinsic value of going on living, a yes to life. We see this same will in our own young children and grandchildren, and we still see it in children at play in the ruins of Syrian cities and Greek refugee camps. As I thought about this, a number of terms gathered in my mind: a will to live, a will for life, joie de vivre, jouissance, a life or vital force, vitality. So I went off to the website, Psychoanalytic Electronic Publishing, the kind of Wikipedia of the psychoanalytic world. Interestingly enough, when I did a search under the term vitality, I got a massive 4,734 results. That's over 4,000 articles in which the term is used. It's ubiquitous. A 40-year-old article by Ruth Abraham in the Psychoanalytic Review caught my attention because it was about Freud's mother, Amélie. It mentioned she had great vitality and much impatience. She had a hunger for life and an indomitable spirit. Although she and her husband had ordinary backgrounds, when Sigmund was born, she declared he would be a great man. The author also notes that his mother held court at her house on Sundays and holidays for over 50 years, and Freud was scrupulously faithful in his attendance to these gatherings. But he also tended to arrive late, and nothing filled his mother with such impatient anxiety as his tardiness. So, some more useful associations: a hunger for life, indomitable spirit. I then did another search under the heading will and found a similar result. A vast number of analysts talk about it, but in a quite unreflexive, taken for granted kind of way. A point made quite forcefully by one of the few articles, and it was on Otto Rank, that I found that makes the concept of will an explicit focus for investigation. There is just one exception to this. My search under vitality revealed that the great developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst Daniel Stern, his last book, published just 2 years before his death in 2012, is called Forms of Vitality. I haven't managed to get hold of a copy yet, but I noticed that the marketing blurb for it states, vitality takes on many dynamic forms and permeates daily life, psychology, psychotherapy, and the arts. And yet, what is vitality? We know that it's a manifestation of life, of being alive. We're very alert to its feel in ourselves and to its expression in others. Life shows itself in so many different forms of vitality. Articles influenced by Stern's book are now just beginning to appear in various professional journals. I noticed that one of the very first was in the Infant Mental Health Journal. And here's an extract which vividly describes vitality at work in infancy. Quote, particularly relevant is the reference to pleasure in functioning, which infants exhibit in front of parental eyes when they reach for some goal, such as grasping a ball in a glass. Connected with this personal feeling is the pleasure in experiencing the self as an effective agent of change, which resides in the perception that through one's own interference, one has changed and can change the course of events once set in motion. So, how interesting. We've come full circle from Hannah Arendt's idea of natality and its central place in her philosophy of action. Remember what I cited from her earlier, quotes, to act means to take an initiative to set something in motion. Or the character of startling unexpectedness is inherent in all beginnings. I think we're in the vicinity of some kind of life force, which is crucial to being human. It's a force which stands opposed to all that is inhuman. This is the force that Arendt, in her internment camp, was in touch with. In the infant, it is manifest in the joy of exploration, of reaching out, of being known, of being curious, of wonder and surprise. Arendt had faced mortality and in the process had found natality, a new beginning. This clearly is the task that faces us societally and politically right now, to find our strength and our moral imagination by facing and opposing the inhuman in society and in ourselves. I want to return to the thoughts of Arendt and Grossman about the Warsaw Ghetto. They argued that hope disarms us, makes us obedient and compliant, and it does this because of the fear that we feel for our own survival. In the middle of the last great fear, 40 years ago, when the prospect of mutually assured destruction, nuclear destruction, seemed incredibly real, the American cultural critic Christopher Lasch wrote incisively about survivalism. Lasch's thesis was that at an unconscious level, people were already preparing for the worst. Quotes, sometimes by building fallout shelters and laying in provisions, more commonly by executing a kind of emotional retreat from the long-term commitments that presuppose a stable, secure, and orderly world. His book examined the ordinary and not so ordinary forms that this survivalism was taking, one of which was the retreat into the self. A few years ago, I consulted with a team who provided therapeutic support to those with terminal or life-threatening illnesses. We were thinking about the sources of strength people found when faced with the uncertainty of death. For example, not knowing whether you've 2 months or 12 months to live. And one of the team mentioned the opposite, how some people would humiliate and embarrass themselves in their desperation to live at any cost. This is what Lasch means by survivalism. Indeed, he uses the words of Lewis Mumford, who, in his critique of appeasement at the time of Munich in 1938, said, "A meaningful world is one that holds a future that extends beyond the incomplete personal life of one individual, so that a life sacrificed at the right moment is a life well spent, while a life too carefully hoarded, too ignominiously preserved, is a life utterly wasted." Overcome by terror, the survivalist individual or group has become demoralized and questions of value have been rendered meaningless and destroyed. The survivalist has lost their love of the world. Instead of a secure attachment to life, there's a desperate clinging. And it is this which is the source of fatalism, passivity and obedience that Arendt and Grossman observed. Faced with societal catastrophe, the survivalist group does what it must do in order to survive. In the landscape of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, this is a vigilant and predatory group whose brutality is fired not so much by sadism as by a cold resolve to live. Where the choices are seen as a victim or predator, it is better to prey than to be preyed upon. What distinguishes man from animal steadily disappears. It is the survival of the fittest. Now, returning to Arendt, from gaining the sympathies of a Gestapo guard through her gift for storytelling, to having the courage to walk out of an internment camp with forged papers, to journeying across France alone on foot in search of her husband, Hannah Arendt acted courageously time and again when she was faced with the opportunity to turn towards either reckless hope or despair. Arendt practiced what she preached. Far from passive and compliant clinging to hope, she had found a love for life that was stronger than a desperation to live. I'll finish there.
दिल से तुझको बेदिली है, मुझको है दिल का गुरूर, तू ये माने के न माने, लोग मानेंगे जरूर। adi